Cool. I found.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for everybody for joining up, and for your patience. I canceled some classes, um, but we're back. All right, so we are back on chapter 6, and that chapter is called configuring basic switch management. Okay. Um, of course, as always, I'm gonna let you guys know. My reference for all of these slides are the content is the CCNA 200-301 second edition, the official Cert Guide and Network Simulator Library. Pretty good deal on Cisco Press. Um, so yeah, definitely go ahead and when you get a chance, go ahead and get that. But here are the objectives that we're going to tackle today from the CCNA 200-301 PDF that goes over what's going to be covered on the exam. Okay, so this chapter is going to cover 1.0 network fundamentals, 1.6 configure and verify IPv4 addressing and subnetting, right? 2.0 network access, 2.8 describe network device management access. So that's using different application protocols, Telnet, SSH, HTTP, HTTPS, um, console, which of course, I'm sorry, just to go back, take a step back, HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol, and hypertext transfer protocol secure, okay, and Radius and TechX Plus, TechX Plus being the protocol developed by Cisco. And of course, this chapter is also going to cover 4.0 IP services, 4.6 configure and verify DHCP client and relay, 4.8 configure network devices for remote access using SSH. You will be asked about that on the exam, so that's why this chapter will be covering it. 5.0 security fundamentals and 5.3 configure device access control using local passwords. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So this chapter, the first part of this chapter is going to go ahead and cover securing the switch CLI. We went over briefly about it before whenever it was talking about, sorry guys, my dog was rubbing my leg. Sorry about that. We briefly talked about the different type of modes. We talked about uh, user mode, we talked about privilege mode, and we talked about, global configuration mode, and of course the different modes for context, meaning interface, BTY, what have you. But how do we secure them, right? So in this section is going to go ahead and cover how to secure user mode, right? How to secure privilege mode, of course, using different type of methods. Um, Also going to go over, securing user mode using external authentication servers. Um, and I love this because again, a lot of the different vendors that you'll probably work with, like one of my favorites, Fortinet, Palo Alto, um, you know, maybe some wireless providers out there. They will all, most of them, and most, and the world that we're going to now, of course, leaning towards 802.1x or zero trust network access. It is leaning towards, um, authenticating against external authentication service. So, um, at a low level, you guys, of course, need to know how to configure that and understand from a logical standpoint how it works. So we're going to go over that. Our lab on Thursday is going to be fun. Um, and of course, we're also going to talk about securing remote access with Secure Shell. And of course, Secure Shell is used in a lot of things that you use every day. So let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. So let's talk about securing user mode and privilege mode with simple passwords, right? So the concept, right? We can go ahead and either if we use console or if we remote into a network device, we get into user mode. We can enable it to the point to where we can go ahead and get into the device, right? With just a password, not a username, right? Putting in, right? Enable secret and which of course will secure privilege mode, and we would be able to get into the device, right? Um, and again, this is the concept of using a shared password amongst network professionals. It's not uncommon, it's just uncommon now, right? There's plenty of environments that still do it. And again, it doesn't matter if it's Telnet, SSH, console, this would apply everywhere. Okay. Um, so let's take a look at how that looks like. Um, you guys being the user, you guys would log in, right? You won't be prompted for your username. You will just be prompted for a password, right? You will type in that password, right? And then of course you'll bring into user exec mode, right? You type in enable to go ahead and get to the um, privilege mode, and of course you type in the password. You type in that enable secret. It will bring you to privilege mode. Um, and of course, this screenshot, you know, I just want to take a quick moment to look at this. Let me go ahead and get my red pencil right here. So this on the screenshot, and this is just for um, the book's purpose, it's showing you the password in plain text. Um, in reality, the switch typically masks and or hides the passwords whenever you type it out. So it's never going to be in plain text or shown on the screen, just to protect from shoulder surfing or what have you, and users just trying to watch out to see what you're typing in. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let me go ahead and erase that. I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. Okay, so let's take a look at a low level how this looks like from a configuration standpoint, right? So using this simple password security configuration, like I told you, the configuration would be, we pencil out again, we would go ahead and type in login, right? And then now, again, we're in one of those contextual modes within global configuration mode, that context being console and, of course, virtual terminal, right? We would go ahead and tell the switch, hey, whenever somebody gets in using these methods, right, prompt them for login, right? And here's the shared password, right? So if they're using console, their password that they're supposed to use is faith, right? If they're using virtual terminals, right, their password is hope, right? And my method, right, the protocol that I allow, right, because there's three options you can use for this command, right? You can use transport input all, which will allow all methods, meaning SSH and Telnet. Um, Another option for this command is transport input Telnet, right? You can use that, or transport input SSH. We spoke about how um, Telnet is unsecure. Reason being is because uh, everything that's used within Telnet is communicated via plain text. So if a bad actor decided they wanted to capture all of my traffic, right, going through the unsecure public internet, um, they would go ahead and see everything that I'm typing. Of course, they'd be able to figure out my password. Okay. That's why we go ahead and push to use secure shell, SSH. Um, and that's another option. But for this configuration example, we have transport input all, so they can use both Telnet and SSH. When that user logs in, right, it's going to go ahead and be prompted at user mode, right? Hey, you're in, right? But if they want to get to privilege mode, they have to go ahead and type in the enable secret. That enable secret being love, right? And that's not going to differ whether you're using console or you're using virtual terminal mode, right? That secret is going to globally affect the entire device, right? Once we type that in, boom, we're in privilege exec mode. All right. Okay, let's keep going. All right. And I wanted to capture this because one of the things, just to be transparent with you guys, one of the things I struggled with in my career is that I was so excited right? To jump in, to figure something, to be a network engineer or what have you, that I didn't realize there was a order of operations, right? Of configuring things. And if you do things out of order sometimes, you can actually break something, or you can miss a step that would um, either, break something or not allow you to go back and fix it. Um, so whenever you're reading this book and you're going through this book and you have a configuration checklist, the config checklist, I love it because it goes in order how to go ahead and configure it, right? So step one, right? Configure the enable password with the enable secret, right? Password and of course the password value command, right? So it's telling you, hey, configure if all else fails, configure the enable secret, right? Because if you pop out of here, right? You pop out of here. If you go back all the way down to user mode, you're going to be prompted. So that adds one layer of security, right? Because our goal is defense in depth whenever we're talking about security, right? So we added that one layer, right? Now let's get a little bit more in depth, right? Step two, configure the console password, right? So my Kivia, right? She wants to go ahead, like she's the senior network engineer, and she has her knock that always comes in that bounces into the switch. She wants to go ahead and secure that, right? So her being the senior network engineer, she goes ahead and she goes to step A and she uses line con zero, right? For that context, right? Whenever we're talking about going to a specific configuration parameter, right? We're talking about the context. The context that we're worried about is the console, anything that's having to do with the console, right? The console port, console mode, or what have you, right? Whatever you want to call it, right? So we're going to use line console zero. That's the command that we have to put within global configuration mode. And we would enter console configuration, right? Step B, use the password value subcommand to set the value of the console password, right? Step C would be use the login subcommand to enable console password security using a simple password, right? So the checklist is telling you, hey, configure the password first, right? Because again, and again, we're following order of operations here based on the professionals that's been doing it for years. Configure the password first, because if you configure login, right? Let's say God knows what, you save your configuration and you forget to configure a password. You are now locked out of your device because it's going to, right? The control plane, the CPU is going to say, hey, I've turned back on, but you saved your configuration before losing power, and you've set anybody that's logging into console to log in, right? So I'm going to prompt them to log in, right? And what this does, again, it enables a console password security using a simple password. Well, there was no password configured. Let's say we missed that step. Now we're in an infinite loop of the knock engineers that work under Markivia are now trying to understand why they can't log in with the password she shared. All right. So it is very important. Sorry about that. That was ESPN, but it is very important for and I urge you guys, being a professional in the field now, look at these tech articles. Try to strive to get these certifications. Google. Watch a lot of YouTubes um, and understand the concept of order of operations when configuring something. You can be excited, but please slow it down because of course, you can misconfigure something. All right, enough of that. Let's go ahead and move forward. Right, step three, of course, configuring telnet VTY password. Right, typically the same thing. Right, use line VTY0 /15 command to enter VTY configuration mode for all 16 VTY lines, right? Numbered 0 through 15, right? Use the password value subcommand to set the value of the VTY password. Use the login subcommand to enable console password security using a simple password, and use the transport input all subcommand or similar to enable Telnet has an input protocol for VTY lines. Just to correct the book a little bit, you can also use SSH um, to connect whenever you do use transport input all. Okay. All right. Of course, we always verify our commands whenever after we configure it, right? So this is an example. We configure the basic passwords, right? We configure it. Everything looks good. We, my Kibia configured both passwords and using the login command for both the console mode and, of course, transport input all for VTY, right? And if we go to verify, right, she does a show running config. We can see we have our enable secret, right? Um, and of course, we can see all the way at the bottom, whenever you're in a Cisco switch, your, VTY lines and your console configuration is always going to be at the end of your show running config command, right? So we have our verification there, everything that's configured. Um, of course, we can save our configuration. If we go ahead and issue a reboot, this would all still be here. And both users that are trying to remote in using remote access or console will be prompted. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about securing user mode access with local usernames and passwords. Right. So same deal, right? Um, the thing that Cisco switches support, right? They don't just support just simple, right, password security. They also support, username password pairs, right? And this is what we can configure here, right? And of course, the concept is called local usernames, right? That is the login security. This is one of the login security method types. Okay, so exactly what you see here. We would go ahead and configure, same difference, right? So my Kivia comes in, right? She's in line console 0 and line VTY 0, 15, right? To tag all 16 VTY lines, right? So instead of using a shared password, right? We go ahead and we erase that out, right? We're not using that no more. Okay. All right. And so instead of just using login, right, we're saying login local. What this is telling the switch, it says, hey, I've configured username and passwords combos locally, not externally. We're not there yet, right? Just locally. Okay. So with that, right, she needs to also go to global configuration mode, right? Because you wouldn't do this within that context mode. She would go ahead and configure username, of course, username Antoine, secret, uh, Antoine's favorite food, right? Or username Gary, secret, um, Gary's favorite food, right? Whatever she wants to configure it as, right? And this, right, once she creates these combos, right, Antoine and Gary, those that work in the knock, would go ahead and log into the switch using both of these methods, both console and VTY, using their local username password combos. Okay, let's look at the configuration checklist. You should take a look at all the steps that, you know, any of you guys will be taking whenever you configure this. And I push you guys to go ahead. Packet Tracer does have the ability to have a switch. Most of the switches in there. You can configure local passwords. So you guys should be good to go ahead and test this out. You don't need a complex setup like EVE-NG or GNS3 to go ahead and try this. Okay, so let's talk about the config checklist, right? So step one, right? Use the username, name, secret, password, global configuration command to add one or more username password pairs on the local switch. So, and I love this because it's telling you, let's not jump, right? And configure. And if I can, and this is just my own thought process on this, right? If I didn't think of anything else, I'm thinking they're telling us these steps and telling you guys these steps as well, right? As you guys read. these configuration steps as if after every situation, all right, every configuration that you do, that you would save the configuration. Of course, I wouldn't advise doing that, right? As far as like every time you configure something, you save the configuration. I wouldn't advise doing that because, again, it's better to test everything. But I believe it's giving you the scenario as if you were saving your configuration after adding something, right? So step one, first you add in those username password combos, right? So we'll go ahead and knock that out. Then we go to step two, right? Configure console mode, right? Why is it telling us to do console mode, right? My own, objective theory is, hey, let's not do VTY yet, right? Because we have an IP address on it. We can remote in. If I configure console mode and something is wrong, I can remote into the switch, right? I can remote into the switch and change the configuration. Okay. So we're going to configure console mode first, right? We configure the console to use locally configure username and password pairs, right? Use and of course step 2-A, use the line con 0 command to enter console configuration mode. Step B would be use the log in local subcommand to enable the console to prompt for both username and password, right? Check versus the list of local username and password, right? Um, and of course, option C, which is optional, use the no password subcommand to remove any existing simple shared password, just for good housekeeping of the configuration file. I would say this is not optional. As a good engineer, I would say this is mandatory. If any of you guys, of course, I tell you guys to check configuration before you make any changes, but you know, just for good measure, type that in just to make sure you don't have a shared password out there, right? So then we go to step three, right? We do the same thing in VTY mode, right? We do the same thing, and then we enable globally for local username and password pairs to be used, right? So the book, of course, has an example. Of course, if we were trying to go ahead and remote into a switch, we would be asked for that local username first, right? Instead of just using simple passwords, now it's prompting us for a username. You type in the username, as you guys can see now, that password is hidden, right? But of course, for the screenshot, let's imagine and say somebody typed it in. Somebody typed it in, we get to enable mode, right? We get asked for our enable secret. We get to user mode. I apologize. We type in enable, right, to go ahead and escalate to privilege mode, right? We type in our enable secret. Boom. We finally get to privilege mode, right? Of course, we go to global configuration mode. We can make changes. We can take a look at everything, and boom, that's what we would see. Okay. Now I know I said a lot of stuff. Any question? And of course, it's been roughly 20 minutes of me talking. Any questions so far? Everyone's good?
Good so far, David. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. Just stop me whenever you guys need to. All right. So now let's go ahead and talk about securing user mode access with um, external authentication service. Right. Um, so even though I love the concept of local usernames and passwords, right, it'll be a headache for any of you guys. Let's say for this example, Antoine um, is the lead knock engineer, right? And Makivi handed him off the task of configuring the local usernames and passwords. If it's a team of 14 and they've grown to a team of 100 in a span of maybe 2 months, that's a lot of overhead for Antoine to put into configuring local usernames and passwords, right? And God forbid there's multiple network devices that he would need to add this configuration to. Of course, we have scripting, we have all that, but that's still a lot of overhead, right? A better option would be to go ahead and use um, the use the option of using external service, right? So Cisco switches does have the ability to use an external server, right? And it's using it by method of AAA, right? AAA standing for authentication, authorization, and accounting, right? So using an external AAA server, right? What'll happen is these AAA servers, they'll go ahead and hold username and passwords, right? Typically, of course, servers, they do self-service, force maintenance to their passwords. What that means, right, is hey, um, somebody in the server team has set on that AAA server or that has a AAA role. They have password policies, they have password age, they have password history, they have a lot of these things, right? So all Antoine, right? Because so if Antoine, for our example, is configuring these switches, right, with the AAA server information, all the username and passwords are managed, right? So these users, these end users will go ahead, and the rest of the knock engineers will just have to, change their mortal or their global, right, username and passwords, right, for the enterprise. And that would apply, of course, to them logging into a switch as well. It wouldn't be more so Antoine managing their username and password combos on the switch, right? So, and of course, working in the field, and you guys know as well, it is a lot of companies use AAA as well. Um, of course, has the technical control from a security standpoint of course, to manage login and logging changes or what have you. Okay, so the thing about configuring AAA is that it's takes a little bit of work, right? And of course, further, later chapters we'll talk about how to configure it, but you will need to know how to do this for the exam. Okay. So this example, now that we can get to the picture, we see, of course, um, we have, let's say we have Max. He's consoling in, right? He puts in his username and password combo that's on the external AAA server, right? Now, Max's PC, right, in this concept, right, is the supplicant, right? So he's supplying the username and password to this switch, okay? The switch is the authenticator, right? Now, with Antoine configuring the switch to be the authenticator, right? That authenticator now needs to pass those credentials to an authentication server, right? The authentication server is that AAA server all the way to the far right, right? The switch passes those creds, right? The AAA server says, hey, these look good, you're approved, right? The authentication server now sends and if we're talking about Radius, because I love Radius, if it sends back an accept message, okay, meaning it accepted those credentials, right? The authenticator, the switch, is going to say, hey, you're approved. Now I can go ahead and allow you to reach the CLI. Okay. This is one of the biggest pieces that you guys want to add whenever you're configuring basic switch management. Okay. All right. Let's roll. And again, we'll talk about this at a later time. But I do want to say, um, again, this is a little bit better than using a AAA server, Radius or TACX, right? Which of course they both encrypt the passwords as they traverse the network. Using that in along with SSH, perfect security. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, let's talk about securing remote access with Secure Shell. Right. So we've talked about so far in the chapter, right? It assumed that you were using Telnet, right? And not so much hearing about SSH. This is just my own personal opinion, right? Again, Telnet, biggest disadvantage. all data, right, within a telnet session, it flows, has clear text, right? So if Mykevia, let's say Mykevia is configuring these local usernames and passwords, right? She's working with Antoine to do it, right? Or Gary just hopping in to go ahead and configure IP addresses for each VLAN, right? All of that is in clear text. Okay. So again, a bad actor, right? If he's capturing that traffic, he can go ahead and capture all of this information, right? Called a man in the middle attack, right? Because he's obtaining information in the middle of the source and the destination, right? So, rough example of the man in the middle attack, right? Um, and get that reconnaissance to go ahead and plan further attacks on your network. Okay, and move over to gaining APT. Right, we don't want that to happen. Right, how do we prevent that from happening? Right, we use SSH. SSH encrypts all data transmitted between an SSH client and an SSH server. Right, in the situation of a switch and a PC. Right, the switch is that SSH server, and of course, our PCs would be the SSH client, right? And of course, using SSH would protect the data and the passwords that flow through, right? Um, Again, SSH can use the same local login authentication method as Telnet. Um, and of course, those external AAA servers that we've talked about before, it can use all of that, but it is recommended by myself, not Cisco. Cisco can't give you recommendations to use SSH, right? So let's talk about this example, right? So, and of course, we'll talk about the config checklist, right? But a couple of things that you see here, right? Let's talk about the SSH specific configuration. With SSH, whenever we're configuring, we need to have a few things. We need to have a host name on the switch. We need to have a domain name. Okay. Right. Um, so of course, once we have those first two things configured, we're going to have our fully qualified domain name. So switch1.example.com, right? So switch1.sony.com. Okay. Right. And then we need to use the command crypto key generate RSA. Okay. And what that is going to do is configure your SSH encryption keys. Okay, which of course in turn is going to um, is going to encrypt that traffic. So that needs to be done, right? Now, once that is done, we can go ahead. Let's say we're using local logins, right? Now we can go ahead and configure that and get into the device, right? But we need SSH to be configured first. Okay. Of course, here's an example. And as you guys can see, I just want to go ahead and point out, right? Once you have to have these configured first, even though we haven't gone over the config checklist yet, you have to have these configured first, then generate your RSA key, right? And once you configure that, right, you'll see the name up for your keys, right? It'll be that host name and the IP domain name. They'll ask you how many bits in the modulus, right? 1024. Of course, you always want to have the largest keys possible, right? So I believe the largest, don't quote me, I believe is the old Cisco switches is 2048. I believe you can get much larger now, right? Because of course with quantum computing, we need to make it a little bit more harder. Um, we also, right, and it's an option to configure SSH version 2. Um, Most switches now, the 9K series, come with that by default, but you always want to verify and make sure because, of course, even the software developers that create the software can make mistakes. Okay. All right. So, as I told you guys before, right, there's different types, right? Um, different types of input that we can go ahead and put in for the transport config, subcommand, right? So we can put transport input all or transport input telnet SSH. It means the same thing. It means support. It supports both telnet and SSH, right? Transport input none. It supports nothing, right? So you can't get into the switch remotely using telnet nor SSH, right? Transport input telnet is self-explanatory, and transport input SSH is self-explanatory as well. Okay. Right? So my favorite part, right? The configuration checklist, right? Because again, it goes over the order of operations. First, it will tell you configure the switch to generate a match public and private key pair to use for encryption. Okay, right? And now that's the general statement, right? But to do this, you would follow steps A, B, and C, right? So exactly how it was shown in the previous example. If not already configured, use the host name in the global configuration mode to configure a host name for the switch. If not already configured, use, which of course is not typically configured on most switches that I see, use the IP domain name in global configuration mode to configure a domain name for the switch, completing the switch's fully qualified domain name. All right. C, use the crypto key generate RSA command in global configuration mode, right, to generate your public and private key. Okay. Right. So we go ahead and knock that out, right? We go ahead and move to step two. It's optional. I'm telling you, it's mandatory for the exam. Um, just remember that it is optional, right? But we go ahead and configure, use the IP SSH version 2 command in global configuration mode to override the default of supporting both versions 1 and 2 so that only SSH version 2 connections are allowed, right? And of course, step three, optional, if not already configured, with the setting that you want, configure the BTY lines to accept SSH and whether to also allow Telnet. Use the transport input SSH command in BTY line configuration mode to allow SSH only. And of course, step 3-B, use the transport input all command or transport input Telnet SSH command in VTY line configuration mode to allow both SSH and Telnet. And last but not least, step 4, use various commands in VTY line configuration mode to configure, which of course, to me, this would be optional. Because again, you can use, remote authentication, what have you, but configure local username login authentication as discussed earlier in the chapter. Okay. Um, I love this because again, this is how you can, you know, outside of your verification commands, here's how you can go ahead and verify the version of SSH that you're using, right? We go ahead and do a show IP SSH. It shows us what's, the SSH version that's enabled, what the authentication timeout is, the authentication retries until it, the terminal times you out. Okay. If you're using SSH, it shows us all the connections, right? Because again, we spoke about how VTY lines are, 16 VTY lines. It starts at 0, right? The first person that logged in, they get assigned 0, right? It tells us the mode, right? That's being used, the version, the encryption scheme, right? So we're using AES 126, CBC, right? And the hashing method, unsecure, right? SHA-1, of course, it lets us know the state started and the username, right? So very good stuff, right? And again, you want to, if you don't have a OneNote now or a thing of notes, you want to compile all of your show commands and make it into muscle memory, right? For the exam, you may be prompted with a command prompt and you may have to, go ahead and get your answer from your show commands, right? So start to go ahead and create a personal library for yourself for that, right? So let's move on. Now let's talk about enabling and securing the web UI. Most switches, right? They they can run a HTTP server, right? Couple of the things that would be configured today or by default, right? Because Cisco's come a long way. Web UI wasn't a normal thing. Uh, there's a couple of things that you can configure, right, to go ahead and make your switch a little bit secure, right? We can go ahead, one, use the no IP HTTP server global command to disable the HTTP server port 80, right? This is enabled by default right out of the box, right? We want to go ahead and disable that, right? HTTP by default is unsecure, right? Per industry standards, right? We can go ahead and use the IP HTTP secure server global command to enable the HTTP server. Port 443 uses TLS by default, right? And of course, we can also use the IP HTTP authentication local global command to define the authentication method. And you need to put this in, right? So your switch knows whenever using the web UI on how and who can log in to the web UI, right? And just a little bit more in detail, that fourth bullet point, use the username name priority. Priority is very important because it tells you the level of access, authorization that you have to make changes, right? You go ahead and configure that, then boom, those users can go ahead and log in, right? The thing with the HTTP server, right? The HTTP server has always allowed three options to log in to a device from a web browser: using an enable password, using a local username and password, and using the AAA settings on the device. Okay. You guys are probably thinking, using your enable password just to log in. Yeah, Cisco did. But again, in the newer OS, right? I've seen it. You can't use the enable password to go ahead and log into the web UI, which again is another vector, right, to operate and get into the switch. But it could be an attack vector, for those bad actors, right? All right. So we go ahead and let's talk about enabling IPv4 for remote access, right? So for us to and we were talking about SSH and VTY lines, right? How can we go ahead and, manage the switch, right? Because we're talking about basic switch management and configuration. How can we manage it and we don't have an IP address, right? This is one of the things that we need configured, right? So we need to go ahead and configure the switch as a host, right? So with it configuring as a host, just like our PCs, it needs an IP address, right? We would go ahead and configure that on a VLAN, right? We can do that on a VLAN interface. You can do it on a regular interface as well, but typically the concept is we go ahead and configure it on a VLAN interface, right? For this example, you see VLAN 1 is configured, right? That SVI, right? The concept of an SVI, switch virtual interface concept within a switch, right? And so we have that configured, right? For this example, right? Let's take a sidestep and let's talk about something real quick, right? So I've told you guys before, the name for switches isn't a layer 2 or layer 3. It's nowadays, especially starting with the 9K series and even back then with the 2K series and the 3K series. Most switches needs to be referred to as a multi-layer switch. It can operate both at layer 2 and layer 3. Okay. For chapter 6, and this is important for context, it's typically referred to, and it assumes that all switches are layer 2. Okay. Whenever we get to chapter 18, we'll talk about IP routing to LAN, which of course it'll talk about, layer 3 switching or what have you. Okay. And of course, using multiple interfaces, VLAN interfaces, what have you. But of course, again, and we spoke about this before, configuring the IP address on a VLAN interface allows a switch to send and receive packets with other hosts in the subnet that exist on the VLAN, right? Um, However, right, the switch cannot um, communicate outside the local subnet without another configuration setting called the default gateway, right? Because your switch can have an IP address. If it doesn't have a gateway, where do I send it? Where do I send my traffic to if I don't know my destination? Okay, right? So I need that default gateway so I can send my traffic outside of my subnet, right? Maybe to the public untrusted network, right? That we call the internet, um, or to another or just to another network, right? So that's what we need, right? Um, but again, let's let's take a step back and talk about how, you know, normal IP traffic works, right? Within a broadcast domain, right? And we're talking about layer three, right? If we were going to go ahead and send IP packets to hosts within the same subnet, right? So Geary and Antoine are trying to ping each other, but they are in the same broadcast domain, right? They're not even going to engage with their default gateway. They're just going to go ahead and just be able to just ping each other. Okay. But let's say Antoine was in the engineering VLAN and I apologize. Um and Gary was in the sales VLAN, right? They would need to go ahead and send to their local router, aka their default gateway. Okay. All right. So that's the concept of needing that default gateway. Okay. So as you guys can see, here's a visual example, right? It would go ahead and we would go ahead and send the those packets that need to go outside of the subnet, right? We send it to our default gateway, our local router, and that router will then, right, that layer three boundary will be able to go ahead and route that traffic, route those packets that are coming within a specific subnet behind it. Okay. Of course, as always, configuring anything that we speak about, configure IPv4 on a switch, we have our configuration checklist, right? Step one, use interface VLAN 1 or any VLAN, right? To get to interface VLAN 1 configuration mode. We would use the IP address mask command in interface configuration mode to assign IP address and a mask, right? We would also use the no shutdown command in interface configuration mode to enable uh, VLAN 1 interface if it's not already enabled, right? Then we would get out of right interface configuration mode and just be strictly in global configuration mode and add the IP to well, I'm sorry, we can stay within interface configuration mode, add the IP default gateway, IP address command, right? We can put that in there. Some switches have that option, or we can go to global configuration mode and add IP default gateway, the IP address, right? And it'll configure that default gateway. Or we can do IP route, uh, quad zeros, double quad zeros, and of course that next hop, you'd be good to go, right? Of course, step five, we go ahead and add that DNS server so it can resolve names to their match an IP address. So you can configure all of this on the switch. Because now, after you configure the switch with an IP address, it is now a host. Okay, here's an example how to configure IPv4 on that switch. This is how it looks like. Okay, well, of course, it being just like our PCs, you do have the option to go ahead and configure your switch to learn DHCP, right? Get an IP address via DHCP, right? We can go ahead and get in the interface configuration mode. Again, follow the same things, but now for the IP address, we would do IP address DHCP. Okay. Here's an example, right? And we do no shutdown, and of course, the switch would get an IP address, right? And this is what we would see here. Here's a verification example. We could do a show DHCP least, we would see that we got an IP address. Here's our information. And again, we wouldn't have to configure a default gateway because it would get that from DHCP. Okay. All right. So, couple of things, right? The end of this chapter talks about some useful commands for whenever you guys are labbing, right? Um, a lot of one big thing, because again, you're going to be typing a lot of things within your lab, is one thing to consider is your history buffer, right? We talked about it in chapter 4, right? You can use the up arrow, the down arrow, Control P, or what have you, to just move within your history buffer, right? But there's a couple commands, right, that you can remember, um, and that can help you for your labs, right? We have the show history command, right? It's a command to go ahead and show um, a list of commands held in your history buffer, your current history buffer, by default if you don't make no changes, right? Right. So we also have the command terminal history size X. From exec mode, this command allows a single user to set just for this one login session, right? It's not static, the size of his or her history buffer, right? Um, and of course, we can also change the history size globally, right? We can go ahead and do that for the console or the VTY lives, okay? Right? We could also talk about the of course useful commands for your lab, right? Is logging synchronous, exec timeout, and no IP domain lookup, right? Um, Login console, of course, whenever you make changes, you will get syslog messages or what have you. Sometimes maybe if you're typing fast, you're typing a lot, you don't want to see a lot of log, you don't see want to see a lot of syslog messages. You can use the feature of disabling logging to the console, right? Or um, you can go ahead and disable that, right? It's if you're not really if you're bothered by log messages, right? Syslog messages, you can go ahead and use the no logging console. It'll go ahead, disable that, and you should be good to go, right? So your people that are in the switch won't be bothered, right? Um, but alternatively, you can use the command logging synchronous, right? And what it does is you can go ahead, right, and use logging synchronous, right? What it does, it tells the switch, right, to synchronize the syslog message display with the messages requested using show commands, right? So you can also do that, right? You can also improve your experience, right, by adding in the exec timeout, right? So let's say we have users within the VTY lines because we only have 16 that are tagging up, that are just logging in and not doing anything. You can use the exec timeout so that if we have maybe, for example, 5 minutes of inactivity, that exec timeout will activate and go ahead and to say, go ahead and kick that user off the session if there's no activity. Okay. All right. So, with that being said, we've talked about a lot of things and we are done with chapter 6. Now we're going to have the lab. Um, we're going to have the lab and we're going to, talk about chapter 6 as much as we are. Couple of things that I want you guys to cover. You guys probably already read chapter 6, but um, I'm always going to push for you guys to read it a third or a fourth time, right? Cover, right? Review all of these things, the key topics, the key terms. Answer the do I already know this already questions. Okay. Review the config checklist. Guys, even starting at chapter 5, you need to start to remembering the configuration checklist, right? Do your labs, review the command tables, watch some of the videos, right? And know a whole bunch of things. A lot of these end of chapter things that you guys see in the book, it is basically telling you if you want to pass the exam, Please know these things. They're giving you a layout. The writers of this book are giving you a layout on how to pass the exams. All you guys have to do is just go through this. Take time out once you finish a chapter. Say, all right, I'm going to go through this, right? Understand these commands, go through it, make it muscle memory, lab as much as you can, and you're good to go. All right, guys, you guys have a great day. Do you guys have any questions before we end the session?
I do actually.
Okay.
Dave, thanks for the session. My question is, does CCNA exam requires to understand or configure AAA server either using Tactides Plus or Radius?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so on the switch level, I guess.
Mm, uh, no, so that's a application protocol, right? So
Okay,
you're going to have to know how to configure it on a multi-layer switch. Okay.
okay.
So you have to
Mhm.
understand all concepts within AAA as it relates to the CCNA. So this is
Perfect.
important for you to read the book
Mhm.
for sure.
Okay, perfect. That's all I had to ask.
Okay. Any other question? That was a good question.
Thank you.
No questions for me. This is good.
All right, guys. You guys have a great Sunday. Okay.
Thanks. You too,
Bye.
guys.